This is where we live. I'm John Dankosky. Today, lawmakers in Connecticut go into special session to talk about criminal justice reform as this comes to the 6-month mark after a tragic home invasion and triple murder in Cheshire that has the state reeling and talking about changes to the criminal justice system. We've been speaking with Jim Ammon, Speaker of the House, who joins us today in studio. Larry Cafaro now joins us. He's House Republican leader. Thanks for being here, Larry.
Thank you, John.
We talked a little bit about some of the points of agreement that we have. We're going to talk about the disagreement in just a little bit. First, let's talk about the points of agreement that House Republicans and House Democrats have with the governor right now. What are you preparing to go forward with that everyone can agree on today?
Well, I think in a very bipartisan way, we have worked over the last several months to come up with various areas that there's no Democratic or Republican way to address some of our deficiencies in criminal justice. There are probably about 18 points that were debated or discussed over the course of the several months. We're probably in agreement on 13 to 16 of them. There's 2 that are outstanding, which, as you said, we'll get to later. But I think I'm very proud and congratulate the Speaker and other leadership on those 16 points that we were able to agree upon, whether it's the issues concerning parole, communications systems, GPS systems, etc. And I think this doesn't mean that today it all ends. We're going to go into regular session in a couple of weeks and continue our discussions, fine-tuning and making improvements as we go along. So I'm optimistic about today. Hopefully we could work out those 2 areas of disagreement and do something good for the people of Connecticut today.
What's your goal out of all this? Ever since this first happened 6 months ago and lawmakers got together and said, well, look, there's a clear pattern of problems here, whether it's communication, whether it's the system itself, whether or not it's tough enough laws. What's your goal coming out of all this?
Well, I think the goal for all of us has to be to state a policy of public safety. People who live in this state deserve to go to bed at night knowing that we have laws in place and a system in place that keeps them safe in their homes, at their workplace, and throughout the areas of this state. That's my goal. We want a system that works. We want a system that gives people peace of mind, that puts the bad guys away, but also, is realistic with regard to how we control our prison population, how we have prisoners who've served their time re-enter society so that there's no chance of them coming back or minimize the chance of coming back. And those are the kind of things we've been working on and discussing throughout.
I want to get to some of the disagreements now that the 2 sides have here. I said in my introduction that roughly, this 3 strikes law that we're talking about, Republicans want tougher sentences, maybe life sentences for those convicted of 3 violent felonies. Democrats want to leave more discretion to judges. On both sides, there's a lot of arguments. A lot of people worry about very tough 3 strikes laws and the unintended consequences that come down the road. I'll go to you first, Larry Cafaro. What are some of the differences specifically on this idea of a 3 strikes and you're out law for repeat criminals?
John, I think it comes down to the word discretion. Right now in our system, we have discretion at the level of the police officer. When he or she makes an arrest, they decide at that moment whether or not to make the arrest and what charges to arrest the individual under. The next part of discretion comes in the form of the prosecutor making a decision as to what statute to charge and prosecute the individual under. The third discretion comes in the judge sentencing. What we're saying is in the most serious of violent crimes, that discretion of the judge should be modified substantially. In other words, if an individual is convicted for the 3rd time by a jury of their peers beyond a reasonable doubt of a serious violent felony, we're talking murder, rape, arson, kidnapping, then we believe upon that 3rd conviction of that serious violent crime, they should go to jail with life, for life. Under the proposal put forth by the governor says that at the end of 30 years, a judge may review that sentence, postpone any possibility of release again, or rule that there is no possibility of release and that individual should stay in jail for life. The difference is the Democrats initially had proposed that that third stage, that judicial discretion, should still be in place. In other words, after the person has been convicted for a third violent felony beyond a reasonable doubt, the judge would still have the discretion at the time of sentencing to sentence that individual to life or something less than life. Right now, we have individuals who've been convicted for 3 violent felonies that are serving an average, this is after their third conviction, John, an average of 7.2 years. That is not acceptable as far as I'm concerned.
There's a big jump between 7.2 years and life sentences.
There sure is. There sure is.
As far as the cost of the state, as far as the individual cost and everything else. So that is a wide gap you're trying to fill.
Well, that's true, but when you are deciding the public policy with regard to public safety, I think it's a very simple question. Do we believe that an individual, after being convicted again by a jury of their peers beyond a reasonable doubt for the third violent felony, rape, murder, arson, should they go to prison for life? My answer is yes.
Jim Amon?
Well, first of all, there may be some rare cases that I don't want Representative Cafaro have the impression out there that people with 3 violent offenses are serving an average of 7.2 years. That is absolutely not true. Under the current persistent offender law, people are serving more time now in prison than ever before. That's what the facts are. Number 2, I don't disagree with Representative Cafaro on some of the things that he did say, and I'll clarify them in a moment. But also, before I get there, again, let us focus on this situation. There is no current 3 strikes and you're out law, whether it be in Connecticut or anywhere else in our nation, that would have convicted these 2 individuals. And again, that's a fact. Nowhere. They didn't have violent offenses. They had petty crimes. So let's not forget that as we debate it. But do I believe some individuals, as Representative Cafaro, should never see the light of day? No doubt about it. Said it. We've been consistent, Larry and I, in all our political careers. But also, he's an attorney, and he knows how the system works. People out there have to realize that because you have a 3 strikes and you're out law, doesn't mean they get arrested. This isn't China, and they go to jail. What they do is they have a court. They are innocent till proven guilty. That's our system. So they still have to have an option of a defense attorney to go before their peers or to plea bargain. It's not an automatic. They still have to sit before a judge. The system is the way that our Constitution has our system, the way it should be. So it's not an automatic in that case. Flexibility has to be the way it is in our system. So let me just finalize by saying this. I do agree with Larry, me personally, and I speak only as a Speaker of the House, I'm going to present to my caucus again today the option, if they want to do the governor's 3 strikes and you're out, and we will see how the caucus reacts to it. I believe it's reasonable also. We have in our current bill a way to fix up to 3 strikes and you're out, but I think as a compromise, the one that the governor put on the table is one that I can personally support, but we'll caucus this and see if the rest of the caucus agrees with me or disagrees.
Couple of comments I made, John. I agree with the Speaker, and he and I have had conversations about it, and I realize that he has a large caucus, and he's speaking for himself, as he just indicated. But a couple of points I'd like to point out. Our current persistent felony offender law, as you know, was ruled partially unconstitutional back in September by our state Supreme Court. And even before it was ruled unconstitutional, because of the difficulty in applying it, and this goes from prosecutors out there, it's only been used in 30 out of 2,500 potential cases. So it really wasn't workable. And I agree with the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And in fact, the fix that they have put in makes it workable. But that is for various gradations of serious crimes, dangerous crimes, etc. What we're talking about is dangerous, serious violent felonies. And what we're saying is, again, after 3 times of being convicted after a fair trial and every opportunity for defense by a jury of your peers beyond a reasonable doubt, that person should go to jail for the rest of their life. Now, the governor's proposal says that after 30 years, that sentence should be reviewed. That is a compromise, a hybrid, if you will, as I've called it, and I think that our caucus would certainly be willing to go along with that as well. But more importantly, I think, we had been focusing on 3 strikes, and that, to me, right now is sort of secondary to a bigger concern we have, and that is with regard to the crime of home invasion itself, the essence of why we're here.
And I want to get to that, and I want to come back to that. Let me just ask a couple things briefly. The Speaker mentions that the individuals in this case were not these persistent violent offenders that you're talking about. So there's not necessarily a way to apply to these 2 individuals the type of 3 strikes law that you're talking about, just so that I'm absolutely clear about that.
The Speaker's absolutely correct, but first of all, no bill we pass will be retroactive to anybody that's already done.
And I understand that, yeah.
However, at least one of the defendants in the Cheshire case was arrested for burglary. Up until this point, as we speak, burglary is not considered a serious violent felony. It is our hope, and that's what we're going to get to next, to make the kind of burglaries that were committed by the individuals who committed the Cheshire murders serious violent felonies. Right now, we don't consider burglary a serious violent felony. I think we all agree that we have to change that. The rub comes, frankly, came as a surprise to me Friday, is how we want to define home invasion or burglary. And I think that is really going to be front and center in today's debate, even more so than 3 strikes.
And one last follow-up on something that you said. Why would we have less difficulty applying this new law than we've had in applying a previous law for persistent offenders?
Right now, if you are charged under the persistent felony offender law, before it was ruled unconstitutional, the jury, after they ruled that you were guilty or not, had to make a decision as to whether or not it was in the public's best interest. Excuse me, the judge had to make a decision as to whether or not this particular individual should be given an enhanced sentence, and then the judge decided whether or not to give the enhanced sentence. That middle step of the jury having to decide not only is the person guilty of the crime as charged, but whether or not they should be given an enhanced step was confusing at best. That has been eliminated, and therefore right after conviction, the judge has the option to give, under the persistent felony offender law that's been proposed, has the option to give an enhanced sentence.
I want to get to the phones real quick, and we're going to touch on some of these other issues. You can call us at 860-275-7266 if you'd like to join our conversation with Larry Kafera, the House Republican leader, and Jim Amon, the Speaker of the House, as they head into special session to talk about criminal justice reforms in the state. Josh is calling from Hartford. Josh, go ahead. You're on Where We Live.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Josh.
I'm calling, actually, I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Children's Advocacy, and so we work a lot with the juvenile end of all of this. And you haven't talked much about the governor's proposal, which includes, or the part of it, I should say, which includes opening up juvenile records to the parole board. And I sort of wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. My thinking is that that could have really bad effects on the juvenile justice system, which is meant to be focused on rehabilitation, because it then creates a situation where the parole board might look back at psychology records, things that were done rehabilitatively in the juvenile system, and actually punish someone later on. And so a defense lawyer at the juvenile level is then obliged to look at what should be a rehabilitation thing as possibly negative in the long run.
Gentlemen, Speaker?
It's a big issue in my caucus, and certainly kids have problems of housing and poverty and all those things that we always discuss in government. And certainly we understand that if a kid makes a mistake, we want to do everything in our power to try to straighten that individual's life out. Prevention is extremely important. I think you see a lot of focus on that. But the other part of the argument is a lot of these kids, unfortunately, like I would say a small percentage of the kids are also violent offenders, whether they be trying to get in a gang or gang banging to try to commit violent offenses and those sort of things. And some of these kids, and I've talked to many judges off the record that have told me that some of the kids become before them are bad kids. And we have to, in society, understand that A lot of these kids may have a chance for rehabilitation. We hope they are. We want to give them opportunities, and certainly my caucus believes in that strongly. But yeah, we have to figure out a way with some of these violent young individuals that are as violent as some of our adults, if in some instances even more violent. We have to come to terms with that and try to deal with that as a legislature. Very, very great question, difficult issue, and one that our caucus is having trouble coming to a conclusion on.
Josh, I think Larry Cafaro talking here. Speaker's absolutely right. It is difficult for all of us. It's a tightrope that we have to walk with regard to preserving some privacy and encouraging rehabilitation on the part of juveniles, but also giving our parole and corrections officers the full story. I happen to be an expulsion officer for the Norwalk Public Schools, and I see a lot of times 16, 17, 18-year-old kids who, under our law, prior to becoming 18, are still considered juveniles. We've just changed that, who have perpetually committed violent crimes. I mean, I had a kid before me just 2 days ago. It was his third time of a violent crime. He took a ball-peen hammer, smashed the bridge of another kid's nose, and punctured his lung with a scissors in an attempt to rob him of marijuana. I mean, we're not talking about, little Johnny who took a stick of gum from the Five and Dime. There's some rough customers out there who by age might be 17 years old, but by their behavior show a pattern of violence that I think has to be known to people when they're trying to make parole decisions, etc. But it is a tight line, and we're going to try, and I think in a bipartisan way, to make sure the proper protections are there, but also the necessary information is there for justice to be carried out. Josh,
thank you very much for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. We've got to take another quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about some of the changes to Connecticut's criminal justice system that have been proposed. They're going to be talking about at the state capitol today in Hartford. Jim Ammon, Speaker of the House, Larry Cafaro, House Republican leader, are here. Join the conversation, Where We Live, on WNPR. This is Where We Live. I'm John Dankosky. You can continue our conversation today on WNPR.org. Our new website lets you add your comments to each episode of Where We Live and interact with other listeners. You can also help us to build future shows by sending us your questions, comments, ideas, contacts. It's all at the new WNPR.org. Just look for Where We Live. Today we're talking about criminal justice in the state. This is a special session at the state capitol set for today. They're going to head straight from here to there. Jim Ammon, the Speaker of the House, Larry Cafaro, the House Republican leader, are talking about some of these proposed changes on which there's a lot of agreement, still some disagreement. We're talking about this. You can join our conversation today on air, 860-275-7266. We're talking about the crime of home invasion. We haven't really gotten to that, sort of the key part to this. This is going to be a big change in the criminal justice system. I'll let you talk about it first. Jim Ammon, why is this so important, making this idea of home invasion, this burglary while someone is at home, while it's the evening, while everyone is asleep? Why is this so important to make a Class A felony?
Well, because I think all of us want to make sure that when we're in our home with our family that there are protections out there, or at least in a criminal's mind that it's not going to be taken lightly. I think it's very important that, someone that's desperate and it's a criminal, it doesn't matter really to them maybe at the time, but maybe to a few it might make them think twice next time. But for the most part, we as legislators, lawmakers, as I said at the beginning of the show, our ultimate, when our goal is, and as being politicians, is public safety. That's our Constitution puts that out. That's what we swear to uphold and make sure that our people are safe. So we have to do everything in our power to hopefully put deterrents out there in laws to protect our homes. Imagine if we're a society that says, well, not a big deal, just like, stealing a pocketbook. Well, with substance abuse problems and those sort of things, believe me, they would be breaking in houses all the time if they thought the penalties were a slap on the wrist. So we have everything. We have to do everything in our power to make sure we keep our homes as safe as we can.
But you talk about comparing this to just stealing a pocketbook. If this case were a different case, might we, Larry Cafaro, be talking about changing some other sort of crime that has never been considered a Class A felony to a Class A felony? The fact is that this was a home invasion. This was a burglary. Do you think that this sort of change really makes a difference in the criminal justice system? It really does deter people. And do you think in any way that we're overreaching? We're saying this is the crime that was committed here, and so therefore we're going to really punish a lot harder this particular crime?
Well, first of all, I think the package you're going to see is a comprehensive package, and it addresses, and I think Jim talked to it earlier before I arrived, so many aspects, parole, etc. But yes, home invasion is the crux of this, and it goes back, John, to the age-old feeling that your home is your castle, it's your sanctuary. If you cannot feel safe in your home, where can you feel safe? Since the Cheshire murders, and maybe it's been because we've been so cognizant of it, there have been 22 reported cases of home invasion. Scary stuff. There was a couple, I believe, in East Hartford on New Year's Eve, a 70-some-odd-year-old couple minding their own business when there's a knock on the door and a gentleman who was high on drugs and booze breaks in and starts rummaging through and running through the house. A 76-year-old man is wrestling off his bed. I mean, you have to have some sense of security, and the Cheshire murders, I think, highlighted that. It was a life-changing event for many. There are people right now that look both ways before they use an ATM. People in Cheshire, I understand, don't go to the grocery store without their spouse with them. Did it highlight it? Of course it did. Is it necessary that we make it a Class A felony? You bet it is, because we realized as a result of the Cheshire murders that we did not categorize burglary, which is home invasion, as a serious violent felony. And it's about time we did that. The rub is how we define that. And that's, I think, what we're going to be debated today.
One of the things I was getting at, though, is a lot of people might suggest that in a town like Cheshire, people are now looking both ways, and they're taking this very seriously. And that's a lot of the state. People are more worried about these types of incidents. There are places in Connecticut, in your Hartford, in your Bridgeport, in your New Haven, in other urban areas, in which this type of daily worry about safety is something that has been going on for a lot longer than the last 6 months. And I'm just wondering how we address some of these issues of persistent violence on the streets of, say, Hartford, not 2 blocks from our studio here, versus the need to overhaul the criminal justice system based on one incident that happened in a suburban community.
Well, John, I think that whether you live in the downtown high-rise of Hartford or the suburban area of Cheshire, your home, apartment, your dwelling, your abode is your castle. And everyone deserves to feel safe and secure in that regard. Are there other crimes that affect your safety that don't include home invasion? Absolutely. And I think we are addressing those with regard to this legislation. We're talking about persistent violent felonies. We're talking about 3 strikes, you're out. Those include crimes that don't necessarily are defined as home invasion, but are rape and murder and shootings and threatening and arson, etc. So I would somewhat disagree that we're only focusing on that. I will agree with you, however. Home invasion is the icon, if you will, the crux of why we're here today on January 22nd in the special session, and is something that everybody takes very seriously. And once again, my concern is that in the last couple of days we've sort of diverged as far as how we want to define home invasion, and that's going to be the, I think, central point of debate today.
Well, do you know, the what he keeps on bringing up, Representative Cafaro, is this piece of language that him and I talked about the other day on the home invasion, which was actually, that's after I found out talking to Larry, was the governor's recommendation from the task force. The language was a little questionable. Since then, I don't know if the minority leader knows that has been changed. The governor did take a second look at it, had been working on stronger language, and I think we're in agreement with the governor now to also, to Larry's concern, that we needed to tighten up that particular part of it. One of the things we were talking about is 2 in the afternoon. You know, you break in with a weapon, it may have more discretion on that individual than if it was at nighttime. Well, society has changed. There's three. Everybody works, sometimes morning, afternoon, and night now. Shifts are different. So you have to adjust to what society is, what the makeup is. I believe that, to his concern, we have addressed that with the governor's office. It seems like we're in agreement. Hopefully, we're going to be able to resolve it. But adding to what Larry said, because I agree with everything he said on the question that you asked him, and that comes to the bigger picture. Our minority population is upset to some circumstance, and rightly so, because they believe that, where were you guys the last 20 years? We've had home invasions in our communities on the news on a nightly basis.
It's a part of daily life in parts of the state.
Absolutely, and they're right, and we can't argue that. All we can say is, you're right. Listen, our eyes are open. They deserve to be as safe as any other community. They're tired of the violence. But it comes to the bigger picture, as we talked earlier. Housing, opportunity, jobs, reentry programs, getting better substance abuse programs. It's a societal problem, and we need to resolve it. And in the minority population, certainly it's should be magnified to what we're discussing on a daily basis that happens in those communities.
And you think you can address some of these things
yes.
along with this in this upcoming session, not just the special session, but some of these things you're talking about are not to be dealt with today.
Correct.
They're to be dealt with in this next upcoming session where you address, there's a big, for instance, there's a big homelessness agenda being put out by the Republican leader in the Senate. There are a lot of things that people are looking at to try to solve some of these issues, and we're going to talk about these beyond just this day-long special
absolutely.
session.
First of all, that's a job of a legislature. I just want to comment, John. I'm heartened to hear the speaker. There is some misinformation going on there. I was at the Capitol till 6:30 last night with the governor's staff, and I confirmed it as of 7:30 this morning. To their knowledge, at least, there has been no agreement with regard to the home invasion language that has satisfied both sides. But if the speaker is right, and I remain optimistic, I'm all for it. But our big concern is, here's the difference, basically. When you walk into a house with a gun, whether someone's home or not, whether it's daytime or nighttime, we consider that home invasion.
And we totally agree. So let's not act like there's a divide here. I agreed with the minority leader the other day on Friday. We've been working on the language. We just have, this was hot off the press before you got here, those are the agreements that we have signed off to tighten up that language with the governor's office, and there's an agreement on that particular part of it.
Well, I hope you're right, Jim.
And I'll let you two debate that at the Capitol in just a couple of minutes when we leave. I've got some callers who want to get into the conversation, like Mariah, from Manchester. Mariah, go ahead. You're on Where We Live.
Hi, John. You've kind of addressed some of the issues I was going to bring up, but in general, I've just been very disturbed as I've been hearing about this in the news, about the fact that this legislation seems to be, a knee-jerk reaction from something that happened in Cheshire, and I want to know why it took this sort of terrible crime in an affluent neighborhood to produce action on the part of our legislature. And I'm wondering if it's going to be another example of legislation that unfairly targets one portion of the population, in this case, people that come from a lower economic status.
Mariah, good question, but let's not forget neither of these individuals were from the minority population. They were two white individuals. So, unfortunately in government, that's the way we work. We hear from the public. We see something that happens that's not working. We try to change it. We are not... we don't have crystal balls that can predict people's behavior. All we can do is try to make the situation better. But Megan's Law was a prime example. When Megan Kanka, we found out in the General Assembly back in 1994,
That was your bill?
in 1994 on Megan's bill, that an average child sex offender in the state of Connecticut was serving less than 2 years. I think all of us were shocked by that. And we made sure that if you had an offense on a child, a rape of a young child, that you were going to do serious time, if not stay in jail the rest of your life, and at least be able to be tracked. So we do change according to circumstance. You make a very good point, because there have been many incidences in minority communities for many years. I can only tell you that I have no answer for that. All I do know is this particular case put a spotlight on a situation where there was communication breakdown in parole, probation, corrections, and our judicial.
Very quickly, Larry.
John, the only thing I agree with Jim, and Mariah, it was a good question. The only part of your question I have issue with is at the end you said passing a law that unfairly targets a certain sector of our population, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. How does passing a home invasion law unfairly target a certain part of our population? That's what I was confused at.
In this case, I'm speaking of an economic population. For example, certain drug laws have been shown to unfairly target minority populations, and I'm wondering if this would be a similar case where it's particularly going to affect perhaps families that come from lower incomes, just if there are going to be side effects that maybe we haven't considered.
Mariah, I think if we get into your question again, I think that there's been a spotlight on that too. I think we really have seen that, and we're educated a lot better over the last 5 months of understanding how important reentry programs are, how important it is that we address substance abuse. If anything, I hope that this is going to be a more just and fair way of treating people with abuse problems, et cetera, in the future.
I want to get to Mike in West Hartford. Mariah, thanks for your call. Mike, go ahead. You're on Where We Live. Quickly, if you would, because we're running low on time.
Okay. I'm listening to this conversation. I got into kind of late, but anyway, I guess the things you're talking about are home invasion, making that a felony, and the 3 strikes are outlawed. I appreciate the legislature looking at this, but I think both of those approaches are wrong. I don't think they're going to deter crime. And I think the 3 strikes law is only going to make our jails overcrowded and divert more money away from the infrastructure, which would be better spent. I think the legislature should be looking more at spending money on what are the root causes of these kind of crimes and trying to eliminate some of the poverty that is going on in our cities right now.
And Mike, I'm going to have you leave it at that quickly, just because I want to get a response quickly from Larry Kafera. We are running short
Well,
of time.
I think we do have to look at causes of poverty, causes of crime, and deterrence. But to me, that doesn't take away the fact that if somebody commits the crime of home invasion as defined, they shouldn't do serious time.
What sort of effect is this going to have on the prison population? Mike is talking about overcrowded prisons. We already have overcrowded prisons, some of which are dangerously overcrowded. What do we do to address this? How many more prisoners does this put into the system? Do we know?
Well, first of all, immediately it puts no more than would normally be in, because if you buy that argument, you're assuming that somebody who's convicted under our current laws goes free. That's not the case. They go to jail. Where this might have an impact is at the end of about 9 years, when normally people would be eligible for parole under, say, a 3 strikes law or a stricter home invasion law. They would be in jail longer. So it is a long-term effect, but also statistics have shown that after about 5 years, there is a easing of that and would balance out. Plus the fact we're also looking at reentry and other ways to have relief valves to keep a balance in our prison population.
With a little less than a minute, Jim.
The gentleman did tune in late because we did discuss many of the things we do have to address, and we have been addressing as a legislature over the last few years. We are focusing a lot on prevention. We are focusing on preschool. We are focusing on after-school programs. We're focusing on housing and also substance abuse programs. We have to address these problems of putting prevention for all our citizens because, A, it saves taxpayers money, and B, it's just good sense.
We're going to look forward to talking about some of these broader issues in the upcoming legislative session. We'll have both of you gentlemen back.
Great.
Jim Amon, Speaker of the House, thank you very much. Larry Kafera, House Republican leader, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. Coming up tomorrow, the country of Turkey straddles the fence between many worlds, Europe and Asia, Islamic and secular, ancient and modern. A discussion of Turkey with NPR's Ivan Watson tomorrow. You can add your voice to the conversation. Where We Live on WNPR.